Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty big, the fetishization of Asian American women.
Yeah, it's one of those topics that can get kind of tricky, Goes way deeper than just like personal preferences.
Absolutely. And we're lucky to have some solid research to guide us this time. We're going to be pulling from a project by Genevieve Askin over at James Madison University.
Yeah, Askin's work is great. This particular one is titled The Fetishization of Asian American Women, Where We Are and Where to Go.
Catchy, right. Really gets at the heart of what we're exploring here. Okay, so one of the first things that jumped out at me was how this whole model minority myth ties into everything.
Yeah, the idea that all Asian Americans are just like naturally successful, hardworking, never complain, all that.
Right, and at first glance, it almost sounds positive, doesn't it? But the research paints a much different picture.
Oh, yeah, it's way more insidious. Like, Askin points out that this myth was actually used as a tool, back during the civil rights movement to kind of pit minorities against each other.
Whoa, I never thought of it that way. How so?
Basically, it was a way of saying, look, these Asian Americans are doing great, so why can't other minorities be like them?
Yeah.
Totally ignoring all the systemic barriers other communities were up against.
So it's like a distraction technique almost?
Exactly. And it had a lasting impact. Because if you just assume a group is problem-free, well, you don't really study their problems.
Right, which leads to a lack of research and understanding, especially for the specific struggles Asian American women face.
Exactly. Think about it. If there's no research, there's no data, then how can you create services that truly meet their needs? Mental health, healthcare, anything.
It's a double whammy, right?
Yeah,
First, you're stereotyped as successful, and then you're denied the support you might actually need because of that stereotype. It's a no-win situation.
absolutely. And here's another layer to this whole thing, even with this myth of them being like the model minority, perfectly assimilated Asian American women are still seen as the other, the forever foreigner.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's like they can't win. They're either held up as a model or seen as perpetually different.
It's true. And that sense of otherness, it's actually baked into the history of the term Asian American itself. Did you know that term was coined by activists back in 1968 as a way to fight for recognition?
No, I didn't know that. So even their identity has been a battleground for decades.
Exactly. And it makes you think even their identity has been a battleground for decades.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got this model minority myth that creates all sorts of problems, and then this constant sense of being an outsider. Where do beauty standards fit into all of this?
Well, you know how messed up beauty standards are for everyone. But for Asian American women, it's like this impossible double standard.
Oh, for sure.
Like they're being held to a Western ideal that often just completely contradicts their natural features.
And it's not just about like superficial looks either. This pressure to conform to a Western ideal can have a way deeper psychological impact.
Right. That's where internalized racism comes in. It's basically when you start accepting society's negative messages about your own racial group, you actually start to believe them.
So it's not just feeling bad about your appearance, it's feeling inferior because of your race.
Exactly. And that manifests in some pretty harmful ways, both for individuals and for the community as a whole. You see self-hate, you see division, all fueled by this internalized pressure.
It makes you wonder, have you ever felt that pressure to change yourself to fit in? Even if it's not about race, it's a pretty universal feeling, even if the reasons behind it are different.
Oh, absolutely. But for Asian American women, this gets even more complicated when you add in yellow fever, basically the fetishization of Asian people, reducing them to just sexual objects.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about that. It's such a tough topic. People try to dismiss it as just a preference, but it's obviously so much more than that.
It really is. And to understand why it's harmful, you got to look at the history, how it's all tied up with colonialism, war, and Western powers, basically exotifying and othering Asian cultures for centuries.
It's not just some random modern thing. It's got deep roots.
Exactly. I mean, one of the earliest examples that Askin brings up is this 1887 novel, Madame Chrysantheme by Pierre Lohi. It basically presented Asian women as these exotic, doll-like creatures existing solely for the pleasure of Western men.
It's just reducing a human being to an object, and sadly, it feels like that kind of thinking has persisted in various forms over the years.
Yeah, it has. Then you add in like the U.S. involvement in wars and colonization in Asia, which kind of amplified the fetishization even further.
And how so?
Well, for one, it created this power dynamic, right, where Western soldiers had authority over Asian populations, contributed to a sense of entitlement over Asian women's bodies.
So they were basically projecting their limited experiences onto an entire group of people.
Exactly. And then, of course, media portrayals. For decades, the only representations of Asian women were these harmful tropes, like the submissive lotus blossom,
Oh,
the
yeah.
dangerous dragon lady.
Right. It's like they were either totally innocent or totally evil with no in between.
Exactly. And it wasn't until much later that we started to see Asian American women representing themselves on screen, telling their own stories.
And even then, they still face an uphill battle against those ingrained stereotypes.
It's like they're constantly having to prove their humanity and complexity. And what's scary is this isn't just about like feeling uncomfortable or objectified. It can lead to real danger.
Right, because it's not just a preference. It can fuel harassment, violence, exploitation. Asian American women are often seen as more submissive or sexually available, which makes them targets.
Unfortunately, yeah. And then when they DO report harassment or assault, it can be harder to be taken seriously
Yeah.
because of these preconceived notions.
It's scary how something seemingly harmless as a preference can create a culture of violence.
And don't forget the impact on mental health. Imagine constantly feeling objectified, reduced to your race, seen as a conquest, not a person.
Absolutely. I mean, research shows that Asian American women who have experienced fetishization often report feeling anxious, depressed, hypervigilant, always on guard, never knowing who might see them as just a stereotype, not a person.
And you know what really stuck with me from Askin's research? Asian American women actually warn each other about dating in certain areas because of the risk posed by men with yellow fever.
Oh, wow. That's really sad. It shows how this seemingly abstract concept has very real, terrifying consequences. And it feels like things haven't gotten much better lately, especially with the rise of anti-Asian hate during the pandemic.
You're right. Remember all those terms like kung flu being thrown around so casually?
Yeah.
It's scary how quickly fear and ignorance can turn into outright racism.
Yeah, and it wasn't just words either. We saw a horrific increase in physical and verbal attacks against Asian Americans.
And it's important to remember that this surge in hate was fueled by political rhetoric and misinformation. When people in power spread those messages, it legitimizes the prejudice and emboldens those who already hold racist views.
Yeah, it's like giving them permission to act on their hate. Sadly, we've seen this kind of scapegoating happen throughout history, targeting different groups based on fear and prejudice. It's like a cycle that's hard to break.
It is. But speaking of fighting for justice, I think it's interesting to look at the hashtag Stop Asian Hate movement and its relationship to the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, that's a complex dynamic for sure. Both movements are fighting against white supremacy, but they've been received so differently. It seems like hashtag Stop Asian Hate gained mainstream traction way faster.
That's a good observation. And there are a few reasons for that. For one, hashtag Black Lives Matter really challenged the foundations of the American justice system, demanding systemic change that made a lot of people uncomfortable.
It was calling for a complete overhaul of how we think about race and power in this country. That kind of radical change is always going to face resistance, especially from those who benefit from the status quo.
Exactly. It's also important to remember that hashtag Stop Asian Hate benefited from the groundwork laid by hashtag Black Lives Matter. The conversations they started about racism and police brutality helped create a framework for understanding and challenging injustice.
So in a way, hashtag Stop Asian Hate was able to build on that momentum.
Yes, but that's not to say there haven't been tensions between the Black and Asian communities. There's a history there. From the model minority myth pitting them against each other to instances of anti-Blackness within Asian communities and vice versa.
So it's a multifaceted relationship with both solidarity and tension.
Right, but it's crucial to highlight the examples of solidarity and shared struggle too. There's a long history of Black and Asian activists working together for social justice. Ultimately, we need to recognize those complexities while working towards the common goal, dismantling white supremacy.
It's about recognizing the nuance of those relationships while acknowledging that we're all in this fight for justice together.
Exactly. And that brings up the most important question. What can WE do about all of this? This deep dive has given us a lot to think about, but knowledge without action is useless, right?
Absolutely. So what are some steps our listener can take?
Well, first and foremost, educate yourself. Seek out diverse voices, challenge your own biases, and be willing to learn. You can't dismantle a system you don't understand.
That's a great starting point, but education isn't enough. We need to speak up too. Call out racism and fetishization when you see it, even if it's uncomfortable.
You're right. Silence is complicity. And finally, support Asian American communities and organizations fighting for justice. That can mean donating, amplifying voices, or just being an ally in your everyday life.
It's about understanding that this isn't just an Asian American issue, it's an issue that affects all of us, and we all have a role to play in creating a more just world.
Absolutely. This deep dive has really made me think about how much we all contribute to these systems, often without even realizing it. It's a good reminder to be more mindful of our own biases and how they might be affecting others.
That's such a powerful point. It's easy to point fingers at others, but real change starts with looking inward, examining our own beliefs and actions. So, with that in mind, what's one question this deep dive has left you pondering? Something that our listener can take away and think about?
Hmm, good question. This deep dive really made me think about how fetishization plays out in pop culture and how those images and tropes continue to influence us even if we don't realize it. How many of us are consuming media that perpetuates these harmful stereotypes?
That's a great question to consider. It's a good reminder to be critical of the media we consume and ask ourselves whose story is being told here? Whose voices are being centered? Are these portrayals challenging or reinforcing those harmful stereotypes? Those are questions we all need to be asking ourselves.
It's crazy how easy it is to just like consume media without thinking about what it's saying,
Yeah.
especially about different groups of people.
Totally. And those messages can be so subtle, like the way a character is framed, the storylines, even just the casting choices, all of it.
Yeah, and it all adds up, right? Creates this whole narrative about Asian American women, who they are, what they're like, how they should be treated. It's a lot.
Makes sense. It's a reminder that representation really matters. We need to see way more Asian American women in positions of power on A&D off screen, telling their own stories, challenging those stereotypical narratives.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
But it's not just about the media we watch, right? It's also about the conversations we're having in our own lives, even with people we care about.
Ooh, yeah, that's a tough one. Like, it's easy enough to call out racism when it's blatant, but what about those, like, subtle digs or jokes, stuff that might be rooted in prejudice, even if the person doesn't realize it?
Exactly. Like, what do you do when you hear someone saying something that perpetuates those stereotypes,
Yeah.
even if they try to frame it as a preference?
It's those moments where you have to decide, am I going to stay silent or speak up? And I know it can be super uncomfortable to challenge people you care about, but sometimes those tough conversations are just necessary.
For sure. And it's not about being aggressive or like trying to shame anyone. It's about coming at it with empathy,
Yeah.
and wanting to educate.
Yeah, like, hey, I know you probably didn't mean any harm by that, but here's why that's not okay. And then, being prepared to explain the historical context, those harmful stereotypes we've been talking about.
Right, right. It's about having the courage to disrupt those harmful narratives, even in your personal life. You never know. You might actually change someone's mind.
I like that. Planting those seeds of change, one conversation at a time. Speaking of resources, where can folks go if they want to learn more, get involved in activism around all of this?
Oh, there are so many amazing organizations doing great work. Well, for starters, we'll link to Askin's full research project in the show notes. It's definitely worth a deeper dive.
Yes, and there are groups like Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Stop AAPI Hate. They're doing such important work on the ground, combating anti-Asian racism, providing support to people who've experienced discrimination.
And don't underestimate the power of social media either. Following Asian American activists, writers, creators, that's a great way to stay informed, amplify diverse voices, even get involved in online activism. It all makes a difference.
Totally. Even small actions can have a big impact. Having these conversations with friends, educating yourself, speaking out, it all contributes to creating a more just world.
It's about being part of the solution, not the problem.
Yeah.
You know, this whole discussion has made me think about how intersectionality plays into all of this.
Right. Intersectionality is so key for understanding how different forms of oppression can, like, overlap and compound each other.
Exactly. It's recognizing that the fetishization of Asian American women isn't just about race or gender. It's about how those things intersect with like class, sexuality, immigration status, all of it.
So an Asian American woman who is also, say, a working class immigrant might experience fetishization very differently than a wealthy second generation Asian American woman.
For sure. And it's so crucial to understand how those different layers of identity can shape someone's experiences.
We can't just make assumptions about someone based on just one part of who they are.
Right, right. Intersectionality reminds us to come at these conversations with nuance and to avoid generalizations. And that leads perfectly into the discussion of allyship.
Okay, yeah, allyship is a big buzzword these days, but what does it actually look like in action, not just theory?
Well, for me, it starts with recognizing your own privilege and using it to amplify marginalized voices. So if you're a white person, that might mean using your platform to speak out against racism and centering the experiences of people of color.
And being willing to listen and learn from those experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Humility is key. But it's not just about listening. It's also about taking action, you know,
Mhm.
showing up for protests, donating to organizations, calling out those harmful behaviors, even within your own friend groups. Actually, especially within your own friend groups.
Being an active participant in the fight, not just a bystander.
Exactly. Allyship is a verb, not a noun. It's about doing the work, even when it's uncomfortable, and realizing that this is a lifelong commitment, not a one-time thing,
It's about constant growth and learning, challenging ourselves to be better allies every single day.
and striving to create a world where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued, no matter their race, gender, any other part of their identity.
I love that. What steps can our listener take to be a better ally to Asian American women in their own lives? What are some like concrete things they can do?
Well, I think the first step is simply being aware of the issues we've been talking about. Knowledge is power.
Awareness is definitely the foundation. Once you're aware of the problem, then you can start taking action. And remember, action doesn't have to be this huge, grand gesture. It can be small, everyday things.
Exactly. Could be educating yourself about Asian American history and culture, calling out racism when you see it, being intentional about supporting Asian-owned businesses. Lots of options.
Or making a conscious effort to listen to and amplify Asian American voices, whether it's online or in your personal life.
It all adds up. Remember, allyship is a journey, not a destination. We're all learning and growing, and it's okay to make mistakes along the way.
The important thing is being open to feedback, challenging our own biases, and just trying to do better.
Because creating a more just and equitable world really does take all of us working together. And speaking of working together, how do we actually start to dismantle those deeply ingrained cultural norms that contribute to this problem?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We're talking about changing centuries of like ingrained beliefs and stereotypes. It's a huge task.
It is. It's not going to happen overnight, but that doesn't mean we just give up. It starts with having those uncomfortable conversations, even when it's with people we love and respect.
And being persistent, we're going to encounter resistance, but we can't let that silence us.
We have to keep speaking out, keep educating ourselves, keep pushing for change. And remember, this isn't just about changing individual minds, it's about transforming institutions and systems.
Right. Like challenging those power structures that perpetuate these stereotypes and create those unequal power dynamics.
Exactly. We need to see way more Asian Americans represented in media, politics, all areas of public life.
And support policies that promote racial justice and equity.
It's about creating a world where everyone has a real chance to thrive, no matter their race.
A world that values diversity and recognizes the unique contributions of each person.
You know, this brings up an interesting point. What role can men play in challenging the fetishization of Asian American women? After all, it's often men who are perpetuating those harmful stereotypes, engaging in those objectifying behaviors.
That's so important to address. Men have this to be a part of the solution. And I think it starts with them recognizing their own complicity in these systems of oppression.
Right, being mindful of their words and actions, understanding how they might be contributing to a culture that devalues and objectifies Asian American women, even unintentionally.
And being willing to challenge other men when they engage in those harmful behaviors. It can be easier to stay silent when your friends are making those jokes or whatever, but true allyship means speaking up.
It's about saying, hey, that's not cool, and explaining why those comments are problematic, and being open to listening and learning from Asian American women about their experiences.
Because you can't be an effective ally if you're not willing to listen to the people who are directly affected by the issue.
Exactly. Men need to recognize that they don't have all the answers and that they can always learn more. It's about stepping up and taking action, supporting organizations that fight for gender equality, amplifying marginalized voices.
It's about being part of the solution, not the problem. And ultimately, it benefits everyone. Men benefit from a more just and equitable world, too.
Absolutely. It's about creating a world where everyone can truly thrive, regardless of gender.
It's a win-win for everyone. This whole conversation has been really eye-opening. It makes me wonder, what would a world without the fetishization of Asian American women actually look like? What would that world feel like?
That's a beautiful question to think about. I imagine a world where Asian American women are seen as complex individuals, not just walking stereotypes. A world where they're valued for their intelligence, their creativity, their leadership, all those amazing qualities they have,
A world where they can walk down the street without being harassed or fetishized.
where they're represented in every area of life. Politics, media, the arts, everywhere. And not just as like tokens, but as their full selves.
Where their voices are heard, their stories are valued, and their contributions are truly celebrated.
It's a world where they can express themselves freely without fear of being judged or objectified based on some stereotype.
A world where they're empowered to define themselves on their own terms.
It's a beautiful vision,
Yeah.
and it's a vision worth striving for. It reminds us that a better world is possible.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in creating that world. This deep dive has really made me think about how fetishization isn't just limited to Asian American women, though.
Oh, for sure. It's part of a much larger societal issue, like a discomfort with female power and sexuality in general.
Right. Like Asian American women are often either hypersexualized or desexualized, but rarely seen as complex individuals with their own agency.
Exactly. It's a way of trying to control and contain female sexuality, and it plays out with women of all backgrounds.
Think about how often women are shamed for being too sexy or not sexy enough.
Or how their worth is constantly tied to their physical appearance and how sexually available they're perceived to be. These double standards are everywhere.
It's all rooted in patriarchy and misogyny. And if we really want to challenge the fetishization of Asian American women, we need to challenge those broader societal norms that limit and control female sexuality overall.
It's about creating a world where women can express themselves freely without fear of judgment or objectification.
And where their worth isn't determined by how they look or how sexually available they're perceived to be.
Exactly. It's about empowering women to define themselves on their own terms.
You know, this whole conversation has me thinking about how we raise the next two generation to be more aware of these issues. Like, how do we break these cycles and teach kids to challenge these harmful norms?
That's such a crucial question. It all starts with having those open and honest conversations about race, gender, sexuality, all of it.
It can be tempting to shy away from those topics with kids, but those conversations are so important.
We have to teach them about the history of racism and sexism in this country, how those systems of oppression are still impacting us today. No sugarcoating it.
And give them the tools to challenge those norms. That means teaching them to be critical thinkers, to question what they see and hear, not just accepting things at face value.
And to be aware of their own biases. We all have them, you know? It's about recognizing them and working to unlearn them.
And most importantly, to speak up against injustice, even when it's hard.
We need to raise a generation that's informed, empathetic, and ready to fight for a more just and equitable world.
It's a big task, but it's a task worth taking on. And even though these issues can feel really heavy and overwhelming, it's important to remember that change is possible.
It is. It starts with each and every one of us. Every conversation we have, every action we take, it can all make a difference. Don't underestimate yourself.
So let's keep having those conversations, keep challenging those harmful norms, and keep working towards that better future. It's a future where everyone can truly be free.
And it's a future worth fighting for. This whole deep dive has really made me think about the power of storytelling. You know, stories have this unique ability to change hearts and minds, to challenge perspectives, to inspire action. It's powerful.
It's true. Stories are how we make sense of the world, and they have the power to shape our beliefs and values. They can be incredibly impactful, for better or for worse.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be mindful of the stories we consume, indeed, the stories we tell. We need to make sure we're amplifying diverse voices, perspectives, not just the same old narratives over and over again.
And challenging those dominant narratives that perpetuate harm and oppression, using storytelling as a tool for liberation, basically.
It's about creating a world where everyone's story is heard, valued, respected, no matter who they are or where they come from.
Where everyone has the opportunity to tell their own story in their own words and have it be received with open hearts and minds.
And where those stories can inspire us to create a more just and equitable world. You know, this deep dive has really made me think about how fetishization is often a way of silencing and erasing the voices of the very people being objectified.
That's a really good point. It's like when you fetishize someone, you're not actually seeing them. You're just projecting your own desires and fantasies onto them.
Right, and by doing that, you're denying them their agency, their voice, their right to define themselves.
It's a form of dehumanization, basically, and it's so important to recognize that and to fight against it.
And that fight starts with listening, really, truly listening to the stories of those who have been marginalized and objectified.
And amplifying those voices, making sure those stories are heard, that those experiences are validated, and that those individuals are seen as human beings with their own thoughts, feelings, and complexities.
It's about shifting the power dynamic, creating a space where everyone feels safe and empowered to speak their truth.
And to be seen and heard for who they truly are, not who someone else wants them to be.
Exactly. This deep dive has really made me think about the importance of self-love and empowerment in combating fetishization. It's like if you are secure in your own identity and worth, you're less likely to be swayed by those external pressures.
That's such a good point. Because, yeah, if you are already solid in who you are, you're less likely to bend to those expectations that are put on you.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for Asian American women to embrace their own beauty, their own culture, their own unique individuality. That's where the real power lies.
It's about rejecting those narrow, often very Eurocentric standards of beauty that we're all bombarded with constantly.
And celebrating the diversity and richness of Asian cultures and heritages. There's so much beauty there.
It's about finding strength and power in your own identity, even if it doesn't fit those dominant narratives that society tries to push on you.
And using that power to challenge those harmful stereotypes
Yeah.
and reclaim your own narrative. It's about taking back control.
Yeah. It's about loving yourself, flaws and all, and recognizing that your worth isn't determined by anyone else's gaze or expectations.
It's about embracing your own agency
Right.
and refusing to be defined by those limiting societal norms. You get to decide who you are.
It's about writing your own story, defining your own happily ever after. That's true liberation, I think.
It is. And it reminds us that true liberation starts from within. So, while we work to dismantle those external systems of oppression, we also need to cultivate that inner strength and resilience.
It's about recognizing that WE have the power to define ourselves, to challenge those limiting beliefs, to create our own narratives. That's a powerful thing.
And that's a message that's relevant for everyone, no matter your background or identity. We all have that power within us.
This has been such an incredible deep dive. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of this whole issue, but it's been so insightful, definitely thought-provoking.
I agree. It's a topic that deserves way more attention and discussion, for sure. Hopefully, this conversation will inspire our listeners to keep learning, keep challenging those harmful norms, and keep working towards a more just and equitable world.
Because remember, this isn't just about Asian American women, it's about all of us.
It's about creating a world where everyone feels seen, heard, valued, and respected for exactly who they are.
A world where we can all truly be free. And there you have it, our deep dive into the fetishization of Asian American women.
It's a complex issue, deep roots and all, but understanding it is definitely the first step toward change.
Remember, this isn't just about Asian American women, it's about all of us dismantling those harmful systems, fighting for a world where everyone is seen and valued as an individual.
Now, to leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question to ponder, what's something this deep dive has made you wonder about, something that's kind of stayed with you?
That's a great question. This whole conversation has really made me think about the role of education in all of this. How can we educate young people about these issues in a way that's engaging, empowering, and inspires them to be agents of change? Not just like lecture them, but actually get them fired up to make a difference.
That's such a powerful question to end on. It's a reminder that this work is ongoing and that we all have a role to play in shaping a better future. We're not done yet.
Yeah, it feels like a huge responsibility, but also like really exciting.
Yeah.
To think we can actually change things.
It is. Imagine a whole generation equipped with the knowledge and the tools to challenge those ingrained biases, create a more just world. That's the dream.
It really is. And it makes me think, this whole deep dive was about unpacking this very specific issue, the fetishization of Asian American women. But the conversation has kind of rippled outward, hasn't it, to touch on so much more.
It has. It's like we started with this one thread, and as we pull on it, we see it's connected to this whole tapestry of social issues: racism, sexism, media representation, cultural norms, how we use language, all of it.
Yeah, it's all connected. We can't address one without addressing the others, which, it can feel overwhelming, but it's also kind of empowering in a way.
It is. Because it means that every action we take, no matter how small, can have this ripple effect. Every time we challenge a stereotype, speak out against injustice, amplify our marginalized voice, we're contributing to something much bigger.
It's like recognizing we're all part of something bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. And that's a really hopeful thought. Even when things feel dark and difficult, we got to remember that we're not alone in this fight.
We have each other, right? And we have the power to create a better world together, not just sit around and wait for someone else to do it.
I love that. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder.
All right, lay it on me.
This whole conversation has really underscored the importance of empathy for me. Like really seeing and hearing each other, understanding each other's experiences, treating each other with kindness and respect, all of that. Basic stuff, but we forget sometimes.
It's so true. Empathy is like the foundation of everything. Without it, we don't get very far.
It's the key to dismantling those walls of prejudice and actually building bridges of understanding instead of just shouting at each other.
It's the starting point for creating a world where everyone feels safe, loved, and valued. That's got to be the goal.
It does. So as you go forth from this deep dive, I encourage you, lead with empathy in every interaction you have. Listen with open ears, speak with compassion, and try to understand those whose experiences might be different from your own.
That's a beautiful message to end on. It's a reminder that even amidst all the complexity and the challenges, there's always hope, always something to work towards.
There is. Because we always have the power to choose kindness, to choose understanding, to choose love. It's up to us.
And those choices, multiplied across millions of people, can truly change the world. Cheesy as it sounds, it's true.
It is. That's a wrap, folks. Our deep dive into the fetishization of Asian American women. It's been a journey, for sure.
It has. We've covered a lot of ground, but I feel like we've only just scratched the surface. Always more to learn, more to understand, more to do.
Definitely. But hopefully this has given you a solid foundation, a new perspective, maybe even spark some ideas for how you can be part of the solution, not just for this specific issue, but for making the world a little more just overall.
Absolutely. Remember, this isn't just about Asian American women. It's about all of us. It's about dismantling those systems that are hurting people.
And it's about fighting for a world where everyone is seen, valued, respected. For exactly who they are, no exceptions.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep those conversations going, keep learning, keep challenging those harmful norms, and most importantly, keep believing in the power of change. It might sound corny, but I truly believe it.
I do too. Together, we can create a better future for everyone.